Willie Phillip is the senior minister of the Tron Church, a thriving Presbyterian church in the city centre of Glasgow. He's also passionate about training preachers and is heavily involved in the work of the Cornhill Trust. And I really appreciated his taking time to chat with me a few days ago. Willie, thanks again for doing this interview. Could you maybe just begin by way of introduction, just give us a quick recap of your ministry journey to this point?
Sure. Well, I began as a medical doctor, so I was working, trained in medicine, worked in various places, was working largely in Aberdeen, training in cardiology, and I'd had a growing conviction for some time that probably some kind of full-time ministry was for me, and so I was accepted for training by the Church of Scotland, and trained. Training perhaps isn't not the best word to use, but I went through the process of studying divinity in Aberdeen, and was assistant in a church there for a while. Then I surprisingly moved, not straight into a parish, but actually moved to London for 5 years, where I was director of ministry at the Proclamation Trust. I was asked to consider going to do that. It hadn't been something in my purview at all, really, but that's what happened, and proved to be a very happy time, really, and very fruitful for me personally, certainly working alongside Dick Lucas and David Jackman. And I said I'd go for 3 years. They then asked me to stay longer, but after I've been there about 5 years, I was called to St George's Tron in Glasgow. So that is coming up for 19 years ago.
Wow.
And as you know, that was, of course, a parish of the Church of Scotland at that time, but with all the ruckus that was going on with the Church of Scotland in 2011, we finally had to separate ourselves from that. Yeah. And 2012, we were shoved out of our building on Buchanan Street. And but we've been very happily continuing there ever since. And they'll be coming up for 19 years this summer.
It's 11 years since you left. Wow.
It is. It's a decade. It was 10 years just past December when we actually left the building.
Yeah.
We had a year when we were trying to cordially negotiate a sensible way forward, but that all unfortunately didn't happen.
So. It didn't work. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, the years just go in, don't they? It's incredible. Yeah. So you mentioned that you're in medical work. So how did you sense or begin to sense that God was calling you into a preaching ministry?
Yeah, I think probably quite early on in my time at university, at medical school, I was very involved with Christian Medical Fellowship, with the Christian Union, served as president of the CU for a couple of years. I was doing a lot of ministry and also in the church in Gilcomston where I was. And I think for quite a long time, I hoped I could combine both, do both things. My family on my mother's side, a long history of mission in Africa, including a lot of medical missionaries. And I think for a long time, I thought that was perhaps for me, but increasingly I realized that what people were encouraging me in was Bible teaching. And I think I realized that actually it's very difficult to do that properly alongside something like medicine, because they're both pretty consuming things. And also in terms of most of the medical missionaries that I knew ended up spending, all their time running hospitals and administering things and all the rest of it. And I just realized that the two things weren't going to happen, and it had to be one or the other. Sure. And so it was hard for me. I loved my medicine, and I'd got past the kind of worst part, and I was really enjoying doing the cardiology. So it was a big tussle for me to do it. I mean, to be honest, I went to the selection school kind of hoping I'd be turned down, but sort of knowing that I wouldn't be.
Okay. Yes.
So yeah, that's how the kind of process went. I actually did think at one time when I was still a student, of just switching and changing, getting out of medicine, going to theology.
Okay.
But wise people, I think, said to me, if that had been the Lord's plan, He wouldn't have started you in medicine, and you should finish it and get some experience. And I'm very, very glad I did do that, because I think my years working as a doctor were very valuable, because it's like ministry. It's about people. And learning to deal with all kinds of different people, and obviously having to take responsibility and that sort of thing was very helpful for me.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sort of Lloyd Jones model, isn't it? Years as a physician and then into ministry. So
I mean, it's I know quite a few people who have ended up in ministry through the medical route, and I think they would all say that medical training does give you quite a lot. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think I probably got more from my medical training of use for ministry than I did from my my so-called divinity training.
That's an interesting comment,
which is not as it should be.
Sure, I understand.
Thankfully, I think things are a lot better now, at least well, perhaps not in the same place, but in places.
Just thinking about those early days in influence, I suspect a part of the answer to this question, I was in the old BTI many years ago, and they used to have visiting speakers in, and there were three that every time any one of them walked in the room, you knew you were in for a treat. Sinclair Ferguson was one of them, George Phillip was one, and Jim Phillip was one, of course, your father. So my question was, who have been over the years the influences, particularly in getting you started, but in terms of modeling, exemplifying good preaching?
Well, I think you've mentioned some of them. I mean, obviously, I had the great privilege of growing up under my father's expository ministry. So, when I was young, that's what I understood normal ministry was. It wasn't until later I realized it wasn't that normal. But
yes,
my father's ministry was formative in my growing up. And I suppose I've come to appreciate it more and more the longer I've been in ministry myself. I mean, my father and his brother, they were remarkable in their ability, but also in their capacity. I mean, my father had extraordinary capacity. I have no idea how he managed to do all that he did. But his clarity and his passion in expository preaching was just something that I suppose I imbibed, and so that was a great influence. As I was a student in Aberdeen and then working there for many years, I was in Gilcomston, so William Still was also a great influence. I mean, I'd known him all my life. He was my father's great friend. My father was converted through him. I was named after him, so we had a close bond. But those years when I was under his ministry was also formative in lots of different ways. Not in the sense that you would sort of emulate him, because he was inimitable, really. Yes. And in some respects, he was the model of everything not to do in preaching.
I know what you mean.
Because he could be all over the place.
Yes.
And yet there was something quite unique and remarkable. So I think that certainly in my earlier years, the two of those would be the biggest influences, simply because I was sitting under the ministry the most.
Of course.
When I went to London, I obviously was working closely with Dick Lucas, and Dick became a great friend and still is. I mean, he's my suppose, only living mentor. He's 97 and a half.
Wow. Yeah, he must be. Yeah.
But I still visit him once a quarter, and I still come away having learned something every time. I mean, Dick had his own unique gifts, and I think latterly I found him, very inspiring and just incredibly helpful in his incisive ability, particularly to get the message of a whole letter or a whole section of scripture. I mean, he had a remarkable gift, I think, particularly of preaching the epistles. I mean, lots of other things too, but so yeah. I mean, I've been extraordinarily fortunate. I've been surrounded by excellent preachers and excellent models in my life, and I suppose having had all the privileges I've had, I'm sure I should have learned a great deal more from all of them than I have. But at least I've managed to pick up, I hope,
Yeah.
some scraps from their tables.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. When I was in London for 7 years and went to Dick's expository, because expositions for expositors, I think he called them.
Yeah.
I mean, cut my teeth on that stuff. Just how to handle the text was just superb stuff. Yeah, absolutely superb. Yeah, it's great. It's great. Looking back, Willie, what advice would you give your younger self, based on what you know now, as it were, I guess? But
Yeah, I think I would. I think I would give myself the advice to just, in a sense, do more of what I did, which was to be inspired by those who really were doing what I wanted to do. And I think there is an important place for training. We need to teach and train and teach people how to handle the word and all of these things. That is really important. But I think personally, I've probably learned more by just imbibing people's preaching. In a sense, some of these things are better caught than taught.
Yeah,
I think we need to do both. But I think I'm glad. There was no Cornell training course when I was starting out. Things, and there were, there are many training courses now in expository ministry which weren't around then in a sort of organized way,
yes,
or were rare.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. But I think that there's also an inherent danger in that you can veer too much towards the technicalities of learning how to do it, rather than also having that great desire to teach the word. So, so I think we all need good models that we can follow, not to try and copy, but to be inspired by. That doesn't happen just by learning a methodology. It happens by imbibing a person's vision.
Sure.
And I think that's an important thing that we need to keep. You can veer too much to one and too much to the other. You can go to the other extreme and say, well, it's all about just emulating a particular preacher, and that sometimes in the past as well. Yeah.
That's helpful. Yeah. As you sort of stand back and look at the preaching scene in the evangelical church, particularly here in the West UK, but maybe elsewhere, how do you assess it? What do you see in it that troubles you? Maybe weaknesses that you identify that need addressing in some way?
Yeah, it's a little difficult to say because I suppose, like most pastors and preachers, we're in our own churches. We're not necessarily seeing and hearing so much of what's going on. You're aware of what's happening in your own circles. But I think there's always. I think perhaps one of the dangers is that evangelicals who rightly are keen to reach out and to be appealing to the non-Christian listener and so on, I think can sometimes have in their own mind a false idea of what those people actually are looking for or are needing. And I think there can be a subtle desire not to put people off and not to be offensive and not to and therefore to tone things down a bit, or to try and be. You often hear, for example, people saying we must be very winsome. Well, of course we want to be winsome, but I take it that Jesus was a very winsome preacher. I take it the apostles were winsome preachers, and that brought great opposition to our Lord and put him on the cross, and all his apostles were martyred. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful sometimes for, under the guise of wanting to be winsome, actually cutting out some of the real challenge. And I wonder whether we are as keen to have clear, real calls to repentance today. Call to repentance, to convert, to turn around. I mean, even the language of conversion is now becoming very controversial. And so that worries me a little bit. My experience, and particularly in recent years, is that there are people who really are asking questions and who are hungry and who are seeking answers. And what they're wanting is not a simplified, dumbed down 10 or 15-minute talk. What they're actually wanting is serious meat. These are the people who are coming to you after you've finished talking for maybe 40 minutes and are asking you more questions and wanting more answers, and are actually saying, I want more of this. I think there's a danger that in trying not to put off those who are not interested and will never be interested, we may in fact be putting off those who are interested and are seeking, but then in listening to us think, well, there's nothing of substance there.
I understand that. That's an interesting take.
So I think perhaps one of the things we need to address is do we really have the confidence that opening up the Word of God really is the power of God for salvation, a power to attract, to make people listen, to really wrestle with the issues and take it in. And I think that's probably a battle for all of us all the time.
Linked to that, can I just throw something else in? I asked somebody else this recently. Are you a you or a we person when you're preaching? Is it second person or third person? I've had quite a lot of interesting conversations with people that in recent years, no, you should be you, should be we. And I'm just interested to know if you have a particular take on
that. You mean never putting people on the spot in the second person?
Yeah, I mean, want to focus that no, it should always be we, inclusive. I'm in the same boat as you are, sort of thing. You is almost over challenging, over direct. My feeling is it's got to be both, depending on the situation and the text. But we shouldn't avoid the you when that's appropriate. And it's linked to what you're saying about being direct.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think obviously you've got to be careful that we as preachers are not putting ourselves in a different category. We're always talking down to you. But I think if it's never, have you done this? Then we're never going to be actually putting people on the spot. And I think this is perhaps one of the results of lots of the great courses that we've got nowadays. We've got CE, Christianity Explored, and we do a thing called Life Course, lots of things like this. But I sometimes wonder whether, in hearing some people preaching, whether they ever actually expect any response here and now. In other words, is the only thing you're really preaching for a decision to sign up for a course?
Right, okay.
What about the person who says, well, what must I do to be saved? You're not going to say, I hope, well, come along on Tuesday night to Christianity Explored. So again, these are very positive things, and I'm glad we have them. But it's the immediacy of the preaching, and I think again, this is sometimes perhaps related to a move away too much from a sort of over exaltation of preaching and the preacher to a horizontalizing of it. In other words, it's just teaching. This is the Bible teaching from me to you, and we're forgetting that actually this is the word of the living God. And when God's people are gathered around His word, it's not just that we hear about His voice. It's that He is speaking. And Paul is so very clear on that when he talks about it in Ephesians 2 about how Christ came and preached peace to you. But what he means is that when Paul came and preached to them, Christ himself was speaking to them. But that's very important, isn't it? Because Christ himself is in the midst. He is the true preacher.
That's right.
And we mustn't lose that. We mustn't, by talking only of teaching, begin to sort of equate it with nothing more than just lecturing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, again, it's about our expectation. If we're not expecting the Lord to be arresting people in the midst of us, well, perhaps he won't.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't have because you don't ask. And that's a
Mhm.
challenge I often have to keep putting to myself, saying, what am I expecting God to actually do in the midst today?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's for the preacher, but also for the congregation.
Indeed. Yeah. No, that's helpful. Yeah, expectancy is a really important aspect, isn't it? And we can sometimes get lulled into this is just more of the same and not expect God to break in or God to do anything dramatic or powerful or anything. And just go with the flow. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And also I think, we can easily think, can't we, that an exposition from an epistle to, the life of the church is somehow not going to be of interest to a seeker. But what I find is that some of the things that are most interest to the non-Christian seekers are the things that most surprise you.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll never forget one time when I was a student in Gilcomston, Mr. Still was preaching through, I think, John's Gospel. And then one week, all of a sudden, he announced, I've decided to have a break in this, and we're starting a series on Leviticus today. And there was a lady in the church who'd been his secretary for a time. Anyway, she'd been praying for a friend to come to church for ages and ages and ages. And finally, she'd relented and decided to come. And she'd come on that day. And she was expecting a sermon on John's Gospel. And when he said, I'm starting on Leviticus, she was absolutely livid. And she sat fuming through the whole service with his friend next to her. Yeah. And she turned to speak to her at the end to kind of apologize for what the subject matter had been, and found the woman in tears and asking how to become a Christian.
Wow.
And that's sometimes the Lord's sense of humor, isn't it? To remind us
yes,
that it's His word.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
I've always remembered that, and try to be challenged by it. We just have no idea.
That's right. I remember many years ago we've just begun a series on Luke, and I was going through the genealogy passage. And I'm a nerd about genealogies anyway, so it fires me up. It doesn't fire many other people up, and I didn't think I'd done a particularly good job of it. And you sort of sit down and you sort of, why did I get out of bed this morning, Lord, etc. And then somebody comes to you afterwards, that happened this morning, and they're just blown away by God speaking directly to them through some aspect of, for some people, one of the dullest passages of Scripture.
Yeah,
and it just shows the power is in the Word, and just expect God to do the unexpected, I think, is something we should think of. Yeah. Well, you've been preaching for a good number of years now, if you don't mind me saying so. What aspect of preaching and preparation do you find most testing at this, most challenging, most demanding, perhaps, at this stage of your preaching ministry?
All of it, I think. Yeah, I think just struggling with the text and really trying to get what this is really all about. I find my most tiring day in the week really is usually is a Thursday, when I'm finally getting to trying to write my Sunday sermon, and I just find that the most exhausting, tough day. I find it a physical battle trying to get the words on the page. Really, I just find I don't find the preaching of it nearly as hard. I find that it's that day in the study when I've got to get everything that I've been working on, all that I've been thinking and reading, and get it into a message. I sometimes find that just almost unbearably exhausting, and it doesn't seem to get any easier.
Okay.
When you start out, you think, "Oh, surely, you get the hang of all this; it'll get easier and easier." I don't think that at all.
Right.
I do find it's just as hard. Really.
Yeah.
But I take it that is it's a supernatural battle.
I think you're right. I'm sure you're right.
And so, yeah, just that battle to really to do it justice. I remember I think it was my uncle used to talk about somebody he knew, a friend of his who was a minister, who wore his big tackety boots always in the study, to remind himself that this was the job of a hard labouring workman.
Right.
He used to say, "Don't wear your slippers in the study,"
Yeah.
because it makes you think you're just relaxing or whatever.
Yes,
It's not that. So I don't physically put my boots on, but
no, I know.
it feels as if I'm kind of walking over broken glass.
It's a good lesson, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. Maybe
So-
that's only me, and I'm just getting less and less good at it. But
No, we're all different, aren't we?
I
Yeah,
find it a struggle.
yeah.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of your ministry involved in training and encouraging other guys into ministry, which I just think is such an important part of what we do as preachers. Two sort of connected questions here, just to finish off with. One is, what one piece of advice would you give to a new or aspiring preacher? And as you've been involved in this over the years, what encourages you most about training other preachers?
Well, I think the advice I'd give to anyone who's aspiring is you cannot learn it except by being involved in it and doing it. So you cannot. The old way of training people, I was trained, you go off to an ivory tower, you take you out of the church and go off and do academic study only. It's a total disaster. So you have to be formed in the life of a church, and you have to have people around you who will mentor you and help you and be honest with you. And so the whole model that I've been involved with Cornhill is very, very much a partnership with the local church. It's a critical part of it. You have your days learning in the classroom, and that's important, and you're doing it there with others who are doing the same thing, but you're putting it into practice all the time, and that's so important, because it's not just about skills. In fact, I believe it's often said that in the qualifications in the pastoral epistles, among all the character issues, there's only one particular gift, and that's the gift of preaching. I don't believe that. I think that also is a character thing. To be able to teach is not, I think, one gift among all these other character things. I think to be able to teach is to be the kind of person from whom others can learn, and that is a character matter.
Yeah.
And Paul puts that in 2 Timothy, in amongst all of those things. And so you need to be able to be shaped by others who are able to be honest with you and tell you this is what you need to do better, or look, this is not really for you. So my biggest piece of advice is do some kind of, we call it apprenticeship, but internship or whatever it is, but where you're learning to do things alongside others who are mentoring you, and you're being nurtured in that. That's what I would
absolutely
say.
Yeah.
And the encouraging thing, I think, is that is happening more and more and more. I mean, 20, 30 years ago in Scotland, most local churches didn't really understand that training for ministry was anything to do with them. And certainly in the mainland denominations, like I was in the Church of Scotland, I mean, I don't think your minister was even necessarily asked for a reference for you. You went off and applied and did it, and it was nothing to do with the church you were in. I mean, it's preposterous. But I think that has changed greatly, and it's encouraging to see more and more congregations of all different denominations and none beginning to see that they have got to take responsibility for future leaders.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think the most encouraging thing to me has been in the last 20 years or so is to see that happening much more widely. It's not just a handful of churches in a sort of university center, but it's happening, and it's being enabled to happen, I think, through towns and even rural settings. So, and I think that's what needs to happen more and more and more, really. But I think we've seen a lot of encouraging advance in that.
Sure. So would you say generally you're more encouraged than discouraged?
I think in terms of training for ministry, I am more encouraged. Yeah, and I think, when I was a young student in Gilcomston, William still used to say repeatedly to people, if you can be happy doing anything else, don't go into the ministry. But he used to say you're far better working on a dust cart and doing something useful for the Lord than and if you can be happy doing that, don't go to ministry. And in a sense, he was saying that because so many young men in the church there were so enthralled by the ministry that they thought, there's nothing else in life I want to do.
Yeah.
So every young man was aspiring to be in ministry. But I think, we've for a long time gone through a stage where people have thought, why on earth would I go into that? The church is such a mess. Surely, you would only do that if you can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And that's catastrophic.
Yeah.
But I think now people are beginning to see again ministries that they feel, well, I'd like to do that, or I'm inspired by that, and young people thinking, there's value in this, and this is worth doing, and I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I am encouraged in that regard. There's a long way to go, and if you look at the church scene in Scotland, top down in terms of the mainline denominations and so on, it is anything but encouraging.
Absolutely.
But I think from the bottom up, I think there are a lot of good people who've been trained and are getting into ministries, and it takes time. You've got to measure these things in decades, not in years.
Yes.
But we need not just good people to be trained. We need church cultures to change and to become committed to training and to seeing that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen quickly, but it starts with people who understood that culture becoming pastors themselves and seeing their job as creating churches which are incubators of leaders.
Yeah. And Peter, that last point you made about people's perception of the ministry changing in different ways, I feel that puts a great responsibility on us who are preachers to convey the right picture, if you like, the right tone. That is realistic but also inspirational. So it puts a responsibility on us to carry that forward, I think.
Yes, I think that is right, and that is that's a key work of the pastor, isn't it? I mean, Paul tells Timothy explicitly that part of his job is to train others who will be trained as others.
Absolutely.
And I think it's one of the problems of that being part of a large grouping or denomination. It takes away that responsibility. And you've got to get that balance right. You need, no very few individual churches can do everything that's needed on their own. So you do need those collegial partnerships.
Yes.
But you must keep those rooted in the life of real churches.
And
I think that means that, again, traditionally, many of those who've been in the institutions, so-called training preachers, have actually been a long, long time removed from pastoral ministry themselves.
Yes.
And that's just not how things work. When I was learning cardiology, when I was learning to put catheters into people's hearts and things, I learned it standing beside the guy who'd been doing it for decades, with his hands on mine, helping me to do it. I didn't learn it from books.
That's right.
I learned it from watching videos.
Yes.
You can learn a certain amount, but you need, and the people who can really teach are the people who are involved in it. And somehow we've got to keep those things from separating. The academy and the church been far, far too separated. And you've got to have ways of putting those together.
That's right. I remember a course I started doing at the old ICC in Glasgow, and I got very disillusioned within the first 2 or 3 weeks, because the first 3 months, I think, it was a part-time course, was on redaction criticism. And I'd been in ministry 25 years, and I thought, I don't need this. It's irrelevant to pastoral ministry. And I was told by one of the lecturers doing it, well, John, you may not be interested in JEDP, but the people in your pew are. And I said to myself, they'd never even heard of it, no one interested in it. But here's a guy who's in his ivory tower, totally detached from reality, And I thought, I don't need this. This is utterly irrelevant. And sitting next to me was a lovely young African pastor from Nigeria, and I can imagine him going back to the bush, and I'm not being patronizing, going back to the bush and telling these folk about, aren't you all interested in JEDP? And it's a crazy view of life.
It's very easy to get completely out of touch with that sort of reality. I mean, I remember when I went to my assistantship, having done my divinity studies, it took me quite a long time to work it out of my system in terms of being able to prepare sermons, because I found myself writing essays.
Yes,
there's a place for essays, all of that, but I just find that I was writing things to be read by others, and A, the way I was doing it, and B, the content of it was just totally useless for what I should be doing. In fact, that's the reason why to this day I handwrite my sermons, because I got so frustrated with writing essays on the computer. One day I stopped and I took out a bit of paper and a pen and started doing it that way, and I found that I could think a talk onto paper, handwriting it, much better than I could do it on the screen.
Interesting.
And to this day, that's what I do.
Wow.
Because that was just an example of how what was supposed to be training me was actually I had to work it out of my system to actually do it again.
Yes.
And what we do in Cornhill, we don't do any essays or anything. What the only things that the students have to actually do in that regard is oral presentations.
Preach,
and they write their scripts and we look at them and so on, but it's all aimed towards the delivery of a message to people. And it's a totally different thing. But you're doing it in the real world with real people.
That's right. Well, I really appreciate it. I just enjoy talking with folk like yourself and sharpening up our thinking and honing my own skills. So thank you for taking the time again, my friend. And the Lord bless you in your own work there in Glasgow.
And you, John.
Okay. God bless you, brother. Thanks.
Okay.
And what Jesus goes on to show us, friends, is unquestionably and unequivocally, he is the Messiah. He is the promised one. He is the anointed one. He's the powerful one, the saving one, the loving